Welcome to the December 2021 CIECAST, ADAS Trends, Implications for the Future of Diagnostics and Calibrations. I'm Paul Berry, Executive Director of CIECA. The Collision Industry Electronic Commerce Association, or CIECA, develops and promotes electronic communication standards that allow the collision industry to be more efficient. We also provide webinars like this one to help educate both members and non-members alike. Today's presenters are Tony Rimas, President of Repairify, and Nick Dominato, Senior Vice President of Product for Repairify. As we start the webinar, I want to remind you that there is no verbal communication between the participants and the presenter. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the question panel on the webinar screen. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. And now I'll turn the program over to Tony. Thank you for joining us today, Tony.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Stacy, and the entire CIECA organization for having us today. I'm joined with my fearless leader, Nick Dominato, Senior Vice President of Product at ADAS Think. Just a quick background on Repairify and how we have evolved the company since 2015. We were the market a leader in using a pass-through technology called Aztec, which was our first asset inside the Repairify family in the collision space to allow that vehicle to use the pass-through device to get to OEM tools in the cloud and also to get to certified technicians to assist in that remote repair activity. We're continuing that path, trying to be the remote partner for the car side repair. We mainly do this through 4 pillars today: diagnostics, calibrations, our highest growth division, the main reason we're here today, remote services, and we also have an insights division. Just to give you some round numbers, Aztec touched about 1.2 million vehicles with the Aztec device in 2020. We just added our 8th brand to the Repairify family alongside Aztec, and this year, we're actually proud to announce we'll actually touch 6.1 million vehicles with those different products and services. But circling back, like I said, calibrations is our main focus on this presentation, but also our highest growth division with double-digit growth quarter over quarter. And with that, our subject matter expert, Nick Dominato.
Thank you so much, Tony. You know, it's fortunate, especially on the ADAS Think side, we get to see so much data coming through. We're lucky to have so many collision shops trust us and trust us to make recommendations. And so the data that we're privy to, we're kind of privileged to share some of that with our audience today. And today I'm going to talk about 5 things. So on our agenda, we're going to talk about some of the ADAS growth trends impacting the industry, and we're going to share some of our internal data that we've gathered with yourselves. Then I'm going to move to OEM developments affecting diagnostics and calibration. So what are some of the trends that we're seeing with the different OEMs and calibration requirements we might see coming down in the future? How ADAS shapes our workflow, the impact of miscalibrations, and then finally we're going to move to how the industry can adapt to the ADAS future and hopefully make some changes for the better. So I'm going to start off with ADAS growth trends. We all know that this has been an area of humongous growth on the OEM side, on the aftermarket side. And NHTSA, the regulatory agency in the United States, publishes a little guide every year about the automaker's commitment to producing vehicles with autonomous emergency braking. And so they actually took a look and they said, well, how many vehicles did the automakers produce from September 19 to August 2020? So this model year 2020 vehicles. And the automakers have committed to reach 99% by 2020 for light passenger vehicles. And it turns out for model year 2020 vehicles, roughly 10 OEMs are already at 95% plus. And those 10 OEMs represent about 40% of the market share. An additional 3 automakers are at 90% plus of their vehicles are being produced with emergency braking today. And so we've got over 2/3 of vehicles being produced today are being shipped with at least autonomous emergency braking. And the automakers have really kind of made a Herculean effort to meet these 99% target deadlines that they voluntarily committed to by 2022. And just as an illustration of kind of what that looks like, we can take a look at this little chart here. Our orange line represents the target, the 2022 target of 99% of vehicles produced with AEB. And we've got Honda in blue, and we've got Ford in gray. And we can see Honda in 2017 was at about 30%, and they've grown, compounded very, very steadily to model year 2020. They're at about 94% according to NHTSA. Ford is even more striking. About 6% of their vehicles produced, passenger vehicles, were produced with AEB in 2017. In the span of 4 model years, they went from 6% to, I believe that's about 91%. So just an absolute Herculean effort by these manufacturers to put ADAS on their vehicles and have them shipped with at least basic safety features. But of course, we know they're not only being produced with AEB, they're being produced with lane keeping, they're being produced with 360 view, they're being produced with parking sensors. But at a minimum, these NHTSA stats indicate that about 76% of model year 2020 vehicles are being shipped with at least autonomous emergency braking. So that's how we're doing on the new vehicle sales side. We're seeing automakers make huge strides and huge forward progress. About 3/4 of vehicles being produced with AEB right now. And so that really begs the question, how's the collision industry doing? So at 76% are being sold with AEB. And our friends over at CCC are kind enough to publish a report annually that says how often are vehicles being calibrated. That's the CCC report. And their most recent mid-year update came out that overall, about 12% of repairable appraisals had a calibration line entry for an ADAS calibration for model year 2020 vehicles. And this isn't a perfect apples to apples, but roughly speaking, about 3/4 of vehicles being sold in model year 2020 have AEB, but only about 12% of those same model year 2020 vehicles being repaired had a calibration entry. So what does that mean on the collision side? It means really about only 1 in 6 model year 2020 vehicles have an ADAS calibration. So 12% of those vehicles being repaired have an ADAS calibration, or 1 in 6. Here's what we've seen on ADAS, on the ADAS Inc. side. 1 in 6 are being calibrated. 3 in 6 should be calibrated. So we have a number of our customers that have trusted us with running their estimates through. And what we found for closed ROs or completed ROs, that about 50% of model year vehicles should receive at least 1 calibration when that estimate is run through ADAS Inc. And you can see the huge growth in calibrations in the collision side. Very, very similar to kind of that growth in AEB. We're seeing that on the calibration side. And for model year 2013 vehicles over on the left-hand side, it's about 8% of model year 2013 vehicles have at least 1 ADAS calibration required. And we fast forward over to the right-hand side of that chart, and we're close to 50% of model year 2020 vehicles require at least 1 ADAS calibration. So what we're seeing on the ADAS Inc. side is, as vehicles become newer, there's more sensors on those vehicles, they're more highly equipped, and we're seeing more and more calibrations. And it's really amazing to see that growth, that compounded growth in calibration. So if you've got a model year 2020 vehicle, it's about a 50-50 chance that that thing is going to require at least 1 calibration. Unfortunately, the actual number is about 12%. And we think that's only going to grow every single year. So that's where we are right now. That's some of the numbers that we're seeing. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about OEM, ADAS development. So what we're seeing in the industry, and I really have a strong personal belief that what we're going to see is a big trend of broader calibration requirements. So that is manufacturers kind of taking a step back, taking a look at their calibration requirements and broadening them out. We've seen a big trend of manufacturers starting with tight or narrow calibration requirements and then reassessing those requirements and broadening them out, because the automakers understand that vehicles are being marketed, sold, driven, and experienced via those advanced driver assistance system features. And it's important for safety and the customer experience that those things work after a collision. I'm going to share a few examples of how these manufacturers are going from narrow to broad. 2016 was kind of an early year for this, but we can see Kia actually came out with their version of the TSB in early 2016 to all of their workshops and said, essentially, if a vehicle has blind spot detection, you must do that blind spot detection system calibration after any rear collision repairs. So that's not something, you may not see that in the actual service information, although typically you will, but Kia in 2016, as early as 5 years ago now, pushed out a TSB saying you must do a calibration after any kind of rear end accident, do a blind spot collision repair. And that's really, again, reflecting the concern that these ADAS systems are working properly. In that same year, Nissan did something very similar with the position statement on the front radar sensor, and I've highlighted the relevant portions where Nissan said that it's critical that these devices are working properly. So any situation where that front radar sensor may be shifted or jolted, it is mandatory to do a calibration on that radar sensor. Interestingly enough, if you look in the service information, so Nissan DSM, may be the case that you only have to do calibration if that radar sensor is removed and installed, or if there's front-end structural repairs. But then you see Nissan kind of coming out with this position statement, broadening out that calibration requirement and saying if there's any risk of jolting or shifting, you must do that calibration requirement. So kind of broadening out that calibration requirement from strictly where they were with the service manual. Honda is very much the same. Typically with Honda, you'll see in the service manual if the sensor is removed and installed, that's typically what you'll see at the year, make, model level. They came out in 2017 was the earliest where they started to push out new guidance on those ADAS system requirements, and Honda's really been a leader in publishing these guides and kind of general purpose bulletins for the collision industry to help repairers understand when these calibrations are required. But in 2017, you can see the multi-purpose camera, when it must be aimed, if the camera is removed and installed, the radar sensor, if the radar is removed and installed, or front-end collision repairs. And they have since revised that manual significantly to where we are in 2021, where we're now at a place that multi-purpose camera in 2017, where the statement was only if the camera is removed and installed. There are now 5 separate calibration events, including if the windshield is removed and installed or replaced, if the camera is removed and installed or replaced, or if there's any kind of structural body repair done to that Honda Civic, which includes not just the main unibody, but also the reinforcement beams, the door intrusion beams, and the bolt-on front bulkhead. So again, kind of moving from that narrower calibration requirements of it's only when you touch the sensor to these broader calibration requirements that kind of reflect a concern that this sensor might have been jolted or shifted or moved. And we're going to see a little bit later on in the presentation of actually what happens when those sensors are shifted even just a fraction of a degree. GM is very much the same. In 2020, they came out, this is our final example here, but GM came out with a wonderful calibration guide as well for repairers. And in a very similar circumstance, that camera, if you had looked maybe 3 years ago, what you would have seen in the GM service information was that you don't actually have to do necessarily calibration if you've just removed and installed the windshield or the camera. They've actually come out and in 2020 came out with guidance and said, after any collision repair in instances where there's more than minor outer body panel cosmetic distortion, or where there's a suspension alignment required, do the calibration. So again, this kind of narrower calibration requirement in the service info, and now we've moved to kind of broadening calibration requirements over the years. And I think that's going to be a trend that's going to continue with other OEMs as they kind of reassess You know, is just removing and installing the sensors sufficient to guarantee the proper working of these sensors? Or do we need to be concerned, especially in the collision context, of kind of harder hits that may jolt or shift these sensors and cause them not to work properly? I think we're going to see more OEMs pay attention to that and broaden out these calibration requirements. And that's really also a big part of what's driving these increased calibration rates that we're seeing over the years. So we know that vehicles are being produced with ADAS, you know, at a greater and greater rate. 3/4 of vehicles model year 2020 had at least a camera or radar sensor in the front. And we know that repairers aren't necessarily, you know, calibrating these ADAS systems as often as they should be. So what's going wrong, right? Fundamentally, ADAS represents kind of a new way that we need to approach our collision workflow. And it's helpful to kind of take a step back and ask ourselves from step one, you know, in the context of advanced driver assistance systems, when does a sensor need to be calibrated? Right? So when does a sensor need to be calibrated? Well, typically, ADAS sensors that need to be calibrated, they're not going to trigger diagnostic trouble code or fault code. They'll often have bent brackets that will be invisible to the naked eye, so they can be bent 3, 5, 10 degrees that from 6 feet away would not be visible to a technician. And they can function improperly for a significant period of time before throwing a fault code or an indicator light, meaning it's not enough to fix the car, drive it around the block 3 times, and make sure that no lights came on. These cars can be driven for dozens of miles or several days in many cases before they throw a fault code. If in fact they do, because we know for a fact that sometimes these sensors will work improperly, you know, for essentially years, and they won't throw a fault code. They'll just have reduced efficacy. So that leaves us with, if we're relying on our scan tool, so if we're relying on our scanner and a visual inspection, that estimator looking at the car and doing a scan, we're going to catch about 5 or 10% of the calibrations that we actually need to do. And that's why we're falling so far behind on the collision side between calibrations that need to be performed, so 50% for model year 2020, and calibrations that are actually being performed, which is closer to 1 in 6. So, talking about diagnostics. Well, diagnostics for ADAS are one, they're a research-driven process driven by OEM service information that we've seen in the last section. You need to look up the service manual for that specific year, make, and model. And very difficult for repairers, calibration events are different between makes, model years, and sensor types. Meaning, calibration requirements for 2014 Nissan Versa might be different for that same radar sensor for a 2020 Nissan Versa. Front radar sensor for a Nissan, those calibration requirements will be different than a Toyota or a GM. It varies by year, make, and sensor type. You're not going to be able to find it on your scan tool, and you're going to have to actually do the research and look up the service information. So repairs are in a very difficult position. I'm going to give you a little case study here of a front radar sensor. We're going to take a look at some of the calibration requirements for that front radar sensor that typically is responsible for adaptive cruise control, emergency braking, and those functions. So if we take a look at our front radar sensor, and if we've got a Ford, we take a look in the service manual. Typically, Ford is always the same. You must do a calibration on that cruise control module if you remove and install or replace the radar sensor. So anytime you take off that radar sensor, you got to do a calibration. But typically, you would not have to do a calibration on that radar sensor for a Ford if you do an alignment or if there's front-end structural repairs, only if you're taking that sensor on and off. If you move over to Stellantis, and again, with Stellantis, it does change between the different brands. But broadly speaking, we're going to have to do a calibration for that very same front radar sensor if we remove and install the radar sensor, but also if there's any front-end structural repairs, or depending on the sensor type, if there are suspension or alignment changes. And this does change within years and within models for Stellantis. This is more of a general guideline. And for GM, we're kind of at the broadest of all. So going back to that GM ADAS document, if you remove and install the radar sensor, if there's an airbag deployment, we're going to have to do a calibration on that front radar sensor. Or if there's collision damage where it's more than minor outer body panel cosmetic distortion, or if we're doing a wheel alignment after a collision. So you can see this same front radar sensor, of course, different manufacturers, but sometimes they're the same. And those calibration requirements are different brand by brand. It's really incumbent on the estimator or the blueprinter to put the time in, pull the service information, and research what that calibration requirement is for the specific vehicle they're working on. And another great example is we've got a vehicle hitting the back here, and we can ask ourselves what needs to be calibrated on this vehicle that's being hit in the back. We can see that the rear reinforcement bar has been damaged. So we've kind of got damage into the rear reinforcement bar and rear body panel. You can see on the side there is a blind spot sensor. We're going to assume that those blind spot sensors are okay. We're going to ask ourselves what needs to be calibrated. Well, interestingly enough, if this vehicle was a domestic vehicle, Ford, Stellantis, or GM, typically we're not actually going to require any calibrations resulting from this vehicle hit. So typically these are programming only events if we're replacing the radar sensor for our domestic vehicles. But even though GM, if we've got more than minor outer body panel cosmetic distortion, we might have to do a calibration on our radar and our front camera, but our blind spot sensors only need programming if replaced. This was a Toyota. We'd likely have to RNI this blind spot sensor to complete the repair. So we'd have to do a blind spot calibration. This is a Honda. That damage has gone into the rear reinforcement bar, which Honda defines as a structural component. And so if this was a Honda vehicle, we'd have to do blind spot aiming, front radar aiming, and a windshield camera aiming if those sensors are equipped on that Honda vehicle. So same damage, but different calibration requirements, wildly different calibration requirements, depending on what that badge is on the grill in the front. And you're not going to know with your scan tool, and you're not going to know by looking at the damage on the vehicle. You got to do the research. And whenever I show this to anyone, and we take a look at the different calibration requirements, it really, brings a question in one's mind, certainly did for me, which is, does it matter, right? So do we really need to do a calibration on that front radar or that front camera sensor if it's hitting the rear, right? Is not doing a calibration just because it may have been jolted or shifted a little bit, is that actually going to affect the operation of the sensor? Certainly something I wondered about. And we're gonna address that right now. But before I do that, I'd like to set the table, if you will. So if we take a look at the United States, we have about 6.8 million vehicle crashes per year, 2.7 million injured persons, and 36,000 fatalities. ADAS sensors make a real difference in claims. This is data from LexisNexis, where they took a look at vehicles that had at least one ADAS sensor. And what they found was if it had at least kind of that one core ADAS feature, we saw a reduction in severity, or in frequency rather, for bodily injury, property damage, and collision claims. You can see 27, 19, and 8% respectively reduction in frequency, and kind of a net neutral impact to severity when the vehicle is equipped with ADAS. So just a massive difference. There's been a number of studies done. I'm not going to canvass them all here, but they're all directionally exactly the same, which is ADAS makes a huge difference. In the United States, about 30% of vehicle crashes are rear-end incidents. And from one 2017 study here, we found that if a vehicle was equipped with forward collision warning, it reduced those front to rear crash rates by about 27%. And if all U.S. vehicles had forward collision warning with emergency braking, we could prevent about 1 million crashes and 400,000 injuries just in 2014 alone. We're going to get there in 2022. We're going to be at about 100% of vehicles produced with AEB. Of course, that doesn't mean all U.S. vehicles on the road will have it, but just a massive impact to property, insurance, and human life. So that's really what we're talking about, the huge impact that ADAS has on people's livelihoods and their property. But the thing to keep in mind is that for these ADAS systems to properly function, they need to be properly calibrated. These ADAS systems rely on highly, highly sensitive sensors, radar sensors and camera sensors that are not perfect self-calibrating machines. They can be knocked out of alignment, and if they are, they're not necessarily going to work. And there's a case study that I like to point to here. This is actually performed by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. And I'm not going to ask anyone to answer this question, but take a look at these three photos. And just take a quick look and ask yourselves, are these three different images, or are these three identical images that we're looking at here? We've got three photos of the camera. So have I just copy and pasted these three, or are these three separate images? And I'm sure most of the attendees here have been to enough presentations to know that these are not three of the same image. These are three different images. The IIHS that took a look at a 2016 Honda Civic, and they found that you could actually rotate that camera within its bracket by about half a degree to the left or right. What you're looking at is the photo on the left. It's being rotated by about 0.4 degrees to the left. The center image is straight down, and on the right image, it's being rotated by 0.6 degrees. And so when we think about, is it important to calibrate ADAS sensors, if they may have been jolted or shifted a little bit as part of a collision, or it may not be looking perfectly in the same spot if they've been removed and installed? Well, the IIHS has said, what's going to happen to this camera sensor if we rotate it in its bracket? And they actually did a study on this. In this case, for this Honda Civic, it was actually responsible for emergency braking on this specific model of the Civic. And what you're taking a look at is that camera sensor in the baseline, so right down the middle, 0 degrees. When they ran it at a target, they started that Honda up at 25 miles per hour, so not too fast. It started to warn at 125 feet out. It started to brake at 53 feet out. And you can see there on the right-hand side, the impact speed was 0 miles per hour, which means the vehicle stopped before hitting the target. It worked properly because the camera was properly positioned and was properly calibrated, as they mentioned in the report. So what's going to happen if we rotate that camera about half a degree? Well, if we take a look at the right alignment condition, so 0.6 degrees, completely invisible to the naked eye, that same ADAS sensor warned at 102 feet out, started braking at 32 feet instead of 53 feet, and hit the impact target at 20 miles per hour from a baseline of 25 miles per hour. So barely even slowed down at a tiny adjustment of 0.6 degrees to the right. Completely invisible to the naked eye. The question is, does it matter? Does doing these ADAS calibrations actually affect the functioning of the sensor? There's been a number of case studies and formal studies done, and the answer is always a resounding yes, it does matter. So when we see these broadening trends of these manufacturers taking a look, reassessing their calibration requirements, and adding on these perhaps seemingly broad requirements of doing a calibration after structural damage or more than minor outer body panel cosmetic distortion. This is why we're seeing the results of sensors failing spectacularly when they've only been misaligned by very, very slight degrees. So we've got a huge influx of vehicles being produced with emergency braking. The collision industry is not ready for it. We're not up to snuff yet. And it really does matter, right? So not doing these calibrations really has an effect on the proper functioning of these sensors. So how can we adapt to our ADAS future? How can we kind of reorient ourselves so that we're fixing vehicles properly, so that vehicle owners are being protected, and so that the benefits of those ADAS sensors and reduction in collision and injuries and deaths, so that we can actually realize those benefits. How can we adapt to this future? What can we do about it? I'm just gonna throw out a few thoughts here. For collision repairs, the answer is simple. We need to make ADAS a part of the process. So we can't rely on our diagnostic scan tool. We can't rely on our body technicians to tell us when a sensor is out of line or needing calibration. We need to bring that process up to the estimator or blueprinter and make sure that they're pulling the procedures and understanding when that sensor needs to be calibrated. On the insurance side, there are some amazing opportunities for ensuring the proper repair of ADAS sensors. A huge, huge trend is this straight-through processing, photo estimating, AI claims. And these AI claims and AI estimating programs are actually capable of writing a line-level estimate. Wouldn't it be interesting that those line-level estimates that those AI estimating systems can produce could run that VIN through a VIN decoder, identify the ADAS systems equipped on the vehicle, and actually as part of that AI photo estimating system, identify the calibrations necessary to that vehicle right when that vehicle owner takes a photo or video of the vehicle and an AI estimate is produced. That's possible today. So we can do it on the repair side, and we can do it on the insurer side as well with the tools that we have available and the technology we have available. It's very, very exciting. This is being brought up on the OEM side. This is being brought up by SEMA. This has been a big topic and some papers presented, but there's a huge problem in the aftermarket around ADAS calibration equipment and lack of standardization. So it costs probably between $100,000 to $200,000 to set up an ADAS calibration facility in terms of having a level floor, enough space, and all the targets you need to calibrate a vehicle. It was remarked on at SEMA just about a month ago that as long as you have the targets that are the right size and the right distances, the software should be able to do a calibration. And I think if we saw the OEMs take some steps towards validating or approving appropriate ADAS calibration equipment, that is where the targets are at the right size and at the right distances, that would go a long way towards kind of alleviating the issues that repairers are having around space requirements and money requirements, by kind of making some space for the aftermarket there. And certainly we've seen that with I think one or two OEMs now, where we've got some validation of aftermarket equipment. Rivian, for example, is one of those with the TruePoint system. So there's a lot that the industry can do. We certainly need to identify this sooner and then hopefully provide the repairers with a little bit more leeway to do calibrations properly, as long as they've got the right tools and the right space requirements. That's it on our end. Appreciate the presentation. Appreciate you tuning in for our presentation. And thank you all for your time.
Great, thanks, Nick. That's really pretty fascinating stuff when you look at just a 0.6 of a degree variation in a calibration, what the impact can be. I'm going to ask Stacy Phillips, who's our marketing director. She's been monitoring the webinar for questions. Stacy, do we have any questions from the attendees?
Yes, we do. Our first question is, how much effort are OEMs putting into making ADAS sensors and systems more self-calibrating in nature where applicable?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Strictly speaking, I think the OEMs themselves, they're not the ones producing these sensors. It's Bosch and Continental and Delphi that are making the investment into self-calibrating sensors. First thing to note is that self-calibrating sensors are already on the market. When we're talking about those blind spot sensors that we canvassed for GM, Ford, and Stellantis, they do have self-calibrating abilities. Same with Volkswagen's blind spot sensors are often self-calibrating. even sensors that do require calibration, like Continental's front radar sensor that's on Tesla and a number of Volkswagens that do actually require calibrations, they also have self-calibration abilities as well. So Continental, for example, it can self-calibrate itself plus or minus 6 degrees vertically and horizontally. That's kind of one of their newer radar sensors. I don't think we're ever going to be in a position where a sensor can self-calibrate itself in the context of a collision repair. What we're talking about here is a sensor that should be able to kind of compensate for mechanical wear and tear, settling of the suspension, for sensors, for blind spot sensors that are located actually attached to the bumper, some bumper warping as a result of cold winter or hot summer, things of that nature. But when we're talking about a quarter panel that's being replaced, or an impact bar that's been smashed as a result of a front-end collision, I don't think that technology is ever going to get to a place where it can completely self-calibrate. And kind of one interesting thing that I think about is you can think about it as kind of running a race between all the investments that these tier ones are making in self-calibration. But on the other hand, is as we approach level 3+, automakers taking on liability for their own vehicles. And I think that once we're in that space, I think the OEMs are going to be a lot more stringent about calibration requirements and making sure that these sensors are working properly. When there's no driver in the seat, there's nobody to take over, and there's nobody to point the finger at in the driver's seat and say, you had the ultimate responsibility. And so we can kind of peek into the future a little bit. And there's photos of Waymo's facility, for example. Those vehicles are self-driving vehicles. They've got LiDAR, camera, radar, ultrasonic sensors. And so if we want to peek into the future a little bit, we can say, well, what is Waymo do, right? So they're living about 3 to 5 years ahead of us. And so in their actual facility in Arizona, those all of their sensors on board that vehicle are self-calibrating. But at the same time, every time that vehicle leaves the facility, not just after a collision, but after any kind of service, those sensors go through a calibration process. So there's going to be, I think what we're going to see is more investment in self-calibration, but I don't think we're going to see calibration after a collision ever go away, especially when liability starts to shift onto the OEMs. And we're talking about the context of self-driving cars, where the OEMs are going to have to pay up if a vehicle gets involved in a crash.
Thank you, Nick. What's your view on digital ADAS recalibration solutions, and are they here to stay?
Yeah, so I think they are here to stay. Certainly, we've seen them in Europe. There are a number of digital ADAS providers. And in fact, some of those digital ADAS solutions have actually been certified by third-party engineering companies in France, for example, and there might be 1 or 2 other examples where we've had these digital ADAS systems and they've actually been certified by kind of outside third-party vendors. I think that as long as you have the engineering kind of talent and certifications or approvals behind a digital ADAS solution, I think we're here to say, I think they offer kind of a great value proposition to repairers in terms of reducing the space required. I mean, we know that if you shrink the targets down and reduce the space, that theoretically it could work. You just have to put enough engineering behind it to kind of to validate it. And as long as that's done in a proper way, like it has been in Europe, I think that could be probably a winning formula. I'm not sure why it hasn't come over to these shores yet, but I think it will.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We have a question about the overall cost to set everything up, including equipment, just a ballpark. Yeah,
so I'm not an expert in that field. I quoted about $100,000 to $200,000. Here's why. I mean, the first thing is if you don't have a wheel alignment machine, you can't do most ADAS calibrations properly. That's the bottom line. So typically, many OEMs for the front radar and front camera, and also the blind spot sensors, will require either a full 4-wheel alignment or a 4-wheel alignment check before doing an ADAS calibration. And if you're a repairer who's concerned about doing things right, and you're calibrating all the vehicles that do need to be calibrated, practically you are going to need a four-wheel alignment machine or a mechanic right next door if you really want to sub it. You're going to need to make sure that your floors are level, and you're going to need a significant amount of space. So the interesting thing is that as a repairer, once you take the four-wheel alignment machine out, a lot of the equipment can be had. You can buy the OEM tools for your domestics and the Asian makes that are not a significant investment. So I hate to throw numbers, but I think I would throw out the number around $20,000, $25,000, and you can get a significant amount of coverage. Once you move over to the European side, you're going to have to sink a lot more money into it. But part of it as a repairer is take a look at your car park, take a look at what you're repairing. But you do need a four-wheel alignment machine, and you do need a level 4 in order to do this stuff properly.
Thank you for that insight. Our next question is, in general, how prepared are auto insurers reimbursing shops for scanning and calibration procedures as recommended by OEMs?
Yeah. So I don't want to get into the debate of, how well are insurers doing on the reimbursement side. So I'll leave that question for now. I will say this though. We've seen, I think, I hope I've shown the last half an hour that kind of calibrations are not intuitive necessarily. The calibration requirements and doing a front radar calibration after a rear end hit and all of those things, I'd say insurers certainly have the right to question whether the calibration is required. Sometimes it doesn't make a whole lot of sense on the face of it. So they certainly have a right to ask questions, to ask for documentation. And it's incumbent on repairers to do that research and in the proper circumstances to provide that documentation. But I'll leave my comments there.
Okay, thank you. And that's all the questions we have for now. So thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Tony. Very good information. I think it's great the industry's keeps up with this rapidly evolving technology. So thank you very much. This presentation has been recorded and will be available later today at CIECA.com. I would invite all attendees to check CIECA.com for a schedule of future broadcasts and to watch recordings of past webinars. Links are available under the CIECAST tab at the top of the page. CIECA has partnered with the Automotive Management Institute. Attendees of this webinar are eligible to receive credit towards a professional designation from AMI after taking a short quiz on its website. A link will be sent to all attendees. Finally, please follow CIECA's social media platforms to stay up to date on upcoming events and CIECA news. And this concludes today's webinar. Thank you.